On June 5th, 1944, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the paratroopers of the Airborne. There, he surprised the anxious but calm young men who were mere hours away from parachuting down behind the German positions that guarded the beaches of Normandy. Faces covered with charred cork soon gathered around to see what the general had to say. There he gave the order of the day: full victory, nothing else. This moment was immortalized by an iconic photograph, a precursor to one of history's most infamous days, D-Day. The invasion of June 6th saw thousands of Allied soldiers storm the beaches of Normandy under intense enemy fire, an extremely bloody scene that took immense courage to face. The soldiers would force their way up the beaches and through the fortified German bunkers and positions. The night before, however, the paratroopers would fly overhead, and from the planes they would parachute down behind the German lines. From there, they could carry out their assigned objectives. This was, of course, a highly dangerous role that required highly trained and skilled soldiers. The planes and parachuting men could be under constant fire, and it was common to land away from your unit and far away from your drop zone, meaning a paratrooper needed to be able to improvise and adapt to whatever situation they found themselves in. Submerged in darkness and surrounded by enemies, all while trying to regroup with your allies, of whom you may have no idea the fate of. This was the basic scenario the soldiers of the photograph were facing. The scene depicts the calm before the storm. Still, you may be wondering, what was Eisenhower saying? Who exactly were these paratroopers? Did they survive the war, let alone D-Day? Well, this is what I set out to answer, the complete backstory of this photograph, and it turned out to be quite the interesting rabbit hole. I suppose we should start with the photograph itself. It was taken at around 8:30 p.m. on June 5th, the day before the invasion, and mere hours before the Airborne would board their planes. They were at the Greenham Common Airfield in England, and the paratroopers began to gather around when they heard Eisenhower speaking with soldiers. It's not known who exactly was the photographer, although the name Moore is commonly linked to it. In any case, there are multiple pictures taken moments apart from each other, although only one was widely circulated. On the back of the original photograph is our first clue. Written in purple ink is the famous order of the day: full victory, nothing else, as well as 11 names of soldiers presumed to be present in the photograph, although there is no indication of who is who. So instead, we're left with a lot of speculation and a lot of outside research conducted in the following decades. Surprisingly, for such a well-known photo, not much was known about the subjects depicted in it for quite a long time. A 1984 Washington Post article by Daniel St. Alban Green did a lot of digging into the matter, as did an investigation in the 1990s when the image was used for a stamp. I've also found further information online to help validate some of the claims, and give you as many details about this scene as I can, with all of the sources, of course, being linked in the description. Now, before we get into the names and subsequent stories, I should say that some of these identities may not be 100% confirmed. I'll try to include the most likely candidates, and all I can discover about their claims and stories. That being said, let's get into the identities of the photograph. Let's start with the obvious one. The most prominent and well-known soldier in the photograph is Wallace Strobel. The 23 sign around his neck was because he was the jump master of Plane 23. Strobel was born in Michigan on June 5th, 1922, meaning that it was actually his 22nd birthday when he was photographed with Eisenhower. Like many others, he spoke personally with the general, and it's possible it was during this conversation that the picture was taken. As he did with everyone, Eisenhower asked Strobel where he was from. When the lieutenant told him Michigan, Eisenhower brought up how he'd been there before and loved the fishing there. And that's what they talked about for a while, fishing. The intense delivery of Eisenhower in the picture is partially why the image is so iconic, but it's interesting that the conversation may not have been so serious, but instead was about fishing. Eisenhower then asked if they were prepared, to which Strobel replied they were, and the general then moved on. Strobel would think very little of their interaction after, and wouldn't even know about the picture's fame until he was surprised to see it on the cover of Time magazine weeks later. However, at the time, his focus was elsewhere, because soon after the photo was taken, he would be jumping into Normandy. He landed miles away from the designated drop zone and ended up stuck in a tree. having to cut himself down before continuing his mission. Strobel fought on in Europe and participated in Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands, as well as the Siege of Bastogne during the larger Battle of the Bulge. He ultimately survived the war and returned home to Michigan. Strobel would marry his high school sweetheart, and together they had 3 children. He lived a peaceful life and earned a living off owning a warehouse company. In 1952, Strobel would actually meet Eisenhower again when the latter was on the campaign trail while running for president. The meeting was brief, however, and the two only managed to shake hands. Strobel passed away in 1999 at age 77. Despite the minor celebrity status the photograph gave him, he always remained humble and never thought too much of it. Our next soldier is widely accepted to be Bill Hayes. As a teenager, Hayes was heavily involved in his high school sports and extracurricular activities. After graduation, he took a job working for Sears. A few years after that, and he was a department manager. When the time for the draft came, Hayes' small stature initially made it difficult for him to join the Airborne, and instead he was given a role in the Armored Force, where he would operate tanks. Hayes didn't find this position to be for him, and put in a transfer to the Airborne, and soon he would be standing in England with his fellow paratroopers of the 502nd and chatting with Eisenhower. The general spoke personally with Hayes, and like he did with most, asked about who he was before the war. The young Wisconsin native told Eisenhower about his job selling paint and wallpaper. The two spoke about Sears, which prompted the general to talk about his experience with the store, and to say how he had just spoken with another soldier who had worked in a factory making women's hats, saying, "Can you imagine a guy doing that and being in an outfit like this?" Not long after the photograph was taken, Hayes was parachuting down into Normandy. Initially, like Strobel and many others, he got stuck in a tree, but after freeing himself, he was eventually able to regroup with his unit. He had actually been presumed dead, but in reality was able to survive the invasion. From France to the Netherlands to Bastogne, Hayes fought his way through Europe. However, it was in Belgium that Hayes would be injured with shrapnel, and his time in the war was over. Following the war, he returned home and at some point would marry. Hayes resumed his job at Sears, working there for decades. Later in life, Hayes would get some recognition from the famous photograph and would be interviewed about the encounter. Bill Hayes would pass away in 2006. Our next soldier is thought by most to be Schuyler Jackson. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1919. At the time of the Normandy invasion, the 25-year-old Jackson was known for his athletic ability and his rambunctious personality, traits that would serve him well. He would survive the invasion and the war, during which he was awarded several medals for his actions, including 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star, which he earned on Christmas Day in 1944 for his bravery in Belgium. After the war, it seemed he lived most of his life in Bethesda, Maryland. He would marry, but later divorce, and also had 3 daughters. Jackson started a trucking company as well. Jackson passed away on his 74th birthday in 1993. He said he was always proud of his service. The soldier with the ammunition bag is thought to be Bill Boyle. Growing up out west, Boyle was said to have cowboyed away in the Badlands of Wyoming. His rough lifestyle would make him an ideal fit for the Airborne, although he had never been in a plane before he began training. Bill Boyle also had a brother who fought in the war. He participated in the invasion on the beach, but unfortunately was killed in action. Bill, however, did survive Normandy and would continue to fight in Europe. He was wounded twice, receiving 2 Purple Hearts and also a Bronze Star for valor. After the war, Boyle returned to Wyoming, married, and lived a quiet life. It seems he and his wife never had children, and that he lived out his days in peace. The officer on the left side of the photograph is believed to be Captain Fred Drennan, the commanding officer for many of those present. Drennan was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1917 and spent much of his early life in Missouri. He enlisted in the Army in 1941 and also married in 1942. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Drennan had been promoted to captain and led many of the paratroopers you see in the battle. It's said that he was the second man to land in France on D-Day. Unfortunately, of the names we have talked about today, Drennan is the lone casualty of war. The 27-year-old captain was injured a couple months after Normandy while fighting in the Netherlands, and later died from his wounds on September 18, 1944. For his actions, he was awarded the Purple Heart, Silver Star, and posthumously the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership and selfless actions. The first 4 soldiers, Strobel, Hayes, Boyle, and Jackson, were all verified by multiple sources, most prominently St. Alban Green's aforementioned investigation, and their identifications in the photograph are questioned by very few, as is the case with Captain Drennan, who is recognizable due to his outfit, and was also identified by Strobel and a stamp expert named John Hochschner, who did significant research of his own in the 90s when the picture was used on a stamp. Together, a few more names can be added to the scene, with Strobel recalling those he remembered to be present, and thus likely candidates for the pictured soldiers. It's now that we get into the more controversial names and disputed identities. I can't tell you who is the accurate identification, who was potentially lying, or who was perhaps present but somewhere else in the photograph, maybe hidden in the background or just out of sight. What I can tell you, however, is the most popular candidates, and let you decide for yourself. I'll start with the more common ones, and end with the more obscure. The soldier with the sketchbook is thought to be Fred Lindsey. Born and raised in Iowa, Lindsey was 22 when he joined a large group gathering around Eisenhower. There, he recalled the lighthearted exchanges with other soldiers and how it overall boosted morale, describing it as good medicine. Lindsey would survive the war and return home, where he started a masonry company. He would also marry and have 4 children. Throughout his life, Lindsey never lost his passion for art and would frequently draw for his local community. Fred Lindsey passed away in 2014 at age 92. The same soldier is also said to be Hans Sannes. Strobel verified that he was present at the scene, and Sannes himself said he was in a couple of the photographs. Sannes was a Wisconsin native who was a part of the National Guard before becoming a paratrooper. He said that during the meeting with Eisenhower, the general seemed more anxious about the upcoming attack than the soldiers were. After landing, he helped secure the town of Carrington and made 2 more jumps into the Netherlands and Bastogne. After the war, Sannes worked as a police officer and later became the chief. Again, it's possible that both Lindsey and Sannes are both in the photograph, just one is somewhere else. This soldier is thought to be O'Neill Bowe. He was born in 1922 in Louisiana. Originally, Bowe wanted to be a pilot in the military. However, he was unable to because of his vision. Instead, he joined the next best thing, the Airborne. After training, Bowe was among many paratroopers in England who would be visited by Eisenhower in the hours before D-Day. Bowe was one of the soldiers to personally speak with the general. Eisenhower asked where he was from. When Bowe told him Louisiana, Eisenhower simply responded with, "Frog Country." O'Neill Bowe would earn a Silver Star during the war when he recaptured a stolen radio from the Germans, in a daring act that saw him brave his way through intense enemy fire. Bowe made 3 combat jumps during the war and afterwards returned home to Louisiana. He would marry, have 5 children, and have a long career as a barber. Bowe remained active in his community throughout his life. In 2017, O'Neill Bowe passed away at age 95. Bowe's claim seems authentic enough, but some question its accuracy, as Bowe was a part of the 82nd Airborne, and this photograph is largely believed to include just the 502nd Division of the 101st Airborne. The soldier is also said to be Carl Vickers, who was a part of the 502nd, and also has the added verification of being present at the scene from Strobel. Aside from sources claiming him to be in the photograph, there's very little online about him. Now it seems this rather hidden soldier, with only his face visible, is possibly Russell Wilmarth. Born in 1919, he lived most of his life in upstate New York. Before the war, he married his lifelong wife. Wilmarth soon found himself at the scene when Eisenhower addressed the troops before he jumped with the rest of the 502nd. 8 days of fighting later, Wilmarth was struck in the leg, and the wound was severe enough to require an amputation. He would recover, but the injury obviously ended his time in the war. He returned home, had 3 children, and lived to be 65, passing away in 1985. Ralph Pombano is also linked to the same soldier. Pombano was a New Yorker from Brooklyn and was also known as a boxer. Strobel did vouch for him being somewhere in the photograph as well. It also seems that Pombano survived the war and lived until 1985. Bill Bowser is said to be this soldier. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1920. He was also a man of small stature, standing at around 5'4", and that seems to be reflected in the photograph, where Bowser recalled Hayes' conversation with Eisenhower. During the Normandy invasion, he took part in Cole's Charge, a famed bayonet charge led by Colonel Robert Cole. Bowser also participated in Operation Market Garden, where he helped evacuate a wounded Bill Boyle. He then fought during the Siege of Bastogne and himself was injured, although he recovered well enough to make it back into action in time to finish out the war. He returned home, married, and had a daughter. Bowser's claim is mostly unchallenged, and he seems to be the best bet to be the paratrooper. William Noel is possibly the soldier on the far right. Strobel said he was present somewhere near at the time the photograph was taken, and is therefore a likely candidate. Henry Fuller is said to be the soldier in between Strobel and Boyle. He too was said to be at the scene by Strobel, and is a potential fit for this identity. Additionally, Strobel also thought Delbert Williams and Michael Babbage were present and are possibly somewhere in the picture, though it is difficult to tell where or if at all. As you can tell, identifying these paratroopers is a bit of a mess. It's possible most, if not all of the claims are somewhat true, and all the positions are just a bit off. Still, it's difficult to 100% confirm most of these. There are of course a lot more names as well, but there's way too many to get into now. I've told you what I can about the paratroopers, but there's still one more name to discuss. Of course, the story of this photograph wouldn't be complete without mentioning the obvious identity, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Allied Supreme Commander and future United States President had the final say on the invasion of Normandy. Despite not taking part in the action, Eisenhower still carried a heavy burden, for it was he who would be sending thousands of young men to their deaths. Days before the planned attack, Eisenhower had been given estimates by some high-ranking officials that the paratroopers would experience extreme casualties. It was thought that upwards of 50 to 75% of the paratroopers would become casualties, with many of those perishing. The invasion had been carefully planned out, yet this staggering proposed statistic troubled him deeply and caused him to have last-minute doubts. Still, the Airborne were very much critical to the success of the invasion, as they needed to be behind enemy lines to cut off reinforcements and supplies to the beaches. Otherwise, the amphibious assault would stand little chance. Ultimately, he would decide to go through with the attack. However, this is probably why Eisenhower paid a visit to the paratroopers just hours before they were to fly into hostile territory. In all likelihood, the surprise visit and conversations were as much to calm his own nerves as they were for the paratroopers. Their preparedness and strength in such a frightening situation gave Eisenhower reassurance that the Airborne would pull through. In reality, the casualties suffered by the Airborne were much less than that projection. The Airborne were well equipped and well prepared for D-Day and were able to overcome the dire circumstances and see their mission through. For such a famous photograph, it's certainly surprising that not much research, save for a few individual investigations, has gone into identifying these soldiers. Perhaps for many it's better that way, so that the picture and the men in it can represent what people want it to: determination in the face of adversity. The nameless soldiers who braved through tragedy and terror. But these soldiers did have names. They did have lives outside the war, and they had dreams of their own. However, they were still very much courageous in a time of uncertainty. Rather than allow fear to conquer them, they instead talked about fishing. If you have any information on the identities of these soldiers, further information on those we've talked about, or have a story you would like to share, please leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching.